Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to Tenian's Corner. I'm happy to present another episode of our After Hour Screen Talk with my brother Dan right here. And we're going to compare the original 1970 version of The Wizard of Gore with its 2007 remake. But we're gonna start with the original 1970 version. The premise centers around this stage magician named Montag the Magician. He performs these elaborate illusions where he selects a volunteer from the audience, specifically a female volunteer from the audience, and then seemingly brutally murders them and mutilates them on stage. But then after the trick, they appear unscathed until later these volunteers wind up dead in grisly fashion, and their deaths mirror the illusions performed on them on stage. That's basically it. It's very much revels in its shock value.
Yeah, these are not plot-driven films.
Yeah.
They're very much, traditional splatter films in the sense that splatter films don't care about plot at all. They don't even really care about character at all. What
Yeah.
they care about is the event of the spectacular violence that the narratives, such as they are, just keep circling back to.
Particularly this film, because it's kind of almost self-referential because it takes the idea of this magic show and uses the idea theme of illusionism, where you have a stage, you have an audience. So, spectacle is like a theme of the movie and how we watch spectacle. It takes this macabre twist on magic shows and illusionism, where the spectacle is death and violence for our enjoyment. But let's take the character of Montag. I mean, the acting in this film is just hands down atrocious. And this guy, who plays him? It's
Ray Sager, I never
Ray
heard of him.
Sager. Yeah,
No.
I don't know the actor, but I mean, he was over the top.
Over the top awful.
Over the
Yeah.
yes. Even when he's backstage, he speaks with the same exaggerated, like theatrical, like over the top style.
Perhaps I have been too hasty in rejecting your proposal. And perhaps you have been too hasty in your evaluation of me.
What?
Oh man, he's looking at the camera.
I think the bad acting is part of the appeal.
Oh, for sure.
It's one of the things we enjoy about these kinds of films.
What did you think of like the actual death sequences?
Mhm.
People getting hacked to death by chainsaws. Like he takes a railroad spike to another lady's head. Then there's like a pump press he kills one volunteer with. Yeah, and they're very graphic and shockingly graphic. I mean, the effects they use, are a little cheesy and dated, but it's still pretty grisly and gross.
Very much so. Yeah, I know. I think it's still effective as far as it goes. I mean, I think what's striking about them is how there's really no attempt to be realistic or strike any kind of um, cinematic realist note with them. They're really styled and presented as pure fantastical spectacle,
Yeah.
um, where you're just lingering on this floridly red blood and these
Mhm.
squishy, shiny organs and the obviously unrealistic malleability of the body, how easily it tears apart, how easily it can be punctured even by just Montag's finger.
Mhm.
Um, and it's weird and wacky and wonderful. And those moments are the reason you watch the film.
But yeah, they're grisly. I mean, Montag is like tearing out entrails and guts and just going for it. The editing is pretty shoddy, and then the music was interesting choice too. This kind of cheerful jazzy music while he's murdering the victims on stage.
The whole thing, I mean, the original film is really disorienting and surreal for that reason.
Yeah.
You're not getting a consistent, seamless appeal to any specific emotion. I mean, the most obvious one is that your sadomasochism is being appealed to as a viewer, but the music really is out of step with that impulse because it's just goofy. It's canned elevator music of the kind that you might hear if you were just walking through a casino or on hold, to try to buy insurance or something. And it has this great alienation effect. You feel very alienated by it, and the violence and the gore, you become alienated from that, and you just start to contemplate it as spectacle. So I think it's interesting that even though the violence, the mutilations are the reason we turn up, we're also kind of alienated from it and put in this, strangely enough, this almost analytical position of viewing it from a distance, sizing it up in a way that is actually counterposed to the kind of prurient, sensual impulses that ostensibly drive these films.
And specifically taking enjoyment in the spectacle of death. And the implications, I mean, it doesn't really tease out the social implications or ethical implications of that. It just shows, glories in the shock value of it, and wants to just like show our fascination as an audience with the grotesque.
Yeah, well, and I think that's one of the things that scholars often find really subversive about these B-movie exploitation films, is that you go to a kind of a big budget, let's say a psychological thriller in the Hitchcock tradition that has middle class respectability. It has a budget behind it. It has an established tradition of cinematic excellence underpinning it. And so when you go to see a film like Psycho, and you watch the woman being hacked to death in the shower, you can kind of obfuscate the obvious sadomasochism. You can say, I'm watching this esteemed piece of artistic cinematic history, and this is great narrative storytelling, and this is art. This is art, right? You get no such comforts with Herschell Gordon Lewis's cinema or with the exploitation cinema. These are films that are transparently made to turn a profit, transparently made to appeal to our worst, most our crassest impulses as capitalistic consumers who are desensitized by the consumer culture we live in. So there's a nice layer, a thick layer of frankness about these films. They're not going to sell you one of the conceits of consumer culture, which is the idea that you're doing something beyond just consuming a product to satisfy these base creature comforts.
The very fact that this film exists, and it's a film about spectacle and the spectacle of torture and the enjoyment we take in it, it is commentary enough, and that's when it gets really subversive.
I think one of the most subversive aspects of a film like this, and about grindhouse exploitation cinema of that era in general, is the way it sneers at and deconstructs traditional cinematic narratives, especially Hollywood continuity narrative. This is nowhere more evident in the way that the splatter scenes are composed, where the editing from a continuity perspective is amateurish to the point of rank parody, where something seems to be happening, but then the next shot shows that apparently we've gone back in time. The body isn't torn open anymore. The innards are back in the abdomen, but then the very next cut after they're back out, and then Montag is like grabbing at them, but then you cut to the audience and they don't seem to be reacting at all, and then the soundtrack cuts out when we cut to the audience versus what's happening on the stage. There is no respect for continuity in that scene. And of course, what's the intent behind that? I mean, we can easily say that this is a slapdash scene that was put together on the cheap as quickly as possible to turn a profit. And that's probably the case. That's probably what really happened. And yet the effect is this incredibly different cinematic experience that provides a fascinating alternative to the kinds of films that you typically go see in the theaters and eventually then watch at home.
They had these like surreal scenes where after the magic trick and show, and he killed these women, Montag would go to their burial site, and one scene like resurrects one of them, and then he would carry their bodies to the mausoleum, and he does this several times, and it has this like red filter that creates this like weird surreal dream-like drug-induced atmosphere, and that's never explained. it's just a weird thing in the movie that's never explained. There's one scene where he's like going to the mausoleum and he, kneels down with a woman. And when he's carrying her, she looks like a corpse, like she's dead. I mean, maybe he's revived her, but I don't know. But then when he bends down, she like moves her hand down almost to prevent herself from falling. I was like, is that intentional or is that just a bad edit?
Those scenes are some of my favorite too, but I was sort of similarly thinking as a viewer, well, I wonder what the reveal is going to be here. What's the payoff? Is he building himself an undead harem? Is that what it is? And
Yeah.
of course, you don't get any of that. But again, this is the thing. These are the things we're accustomed to do as viewers. We make guesses about what the meaning might be, but then we expect that it'll be revealed later, and then we'll be edified by that. It doesn't happen.
So at the end of the movie, Montag goes on Sherry, this TV host show. He just wants to perform his grisly magic trick, which involves him through the TV hypnotizing the masses, including both Sherry and everyone in the studio. And then he leads them to be burned alive. And then her boyfriend, Jack, he rushes in there and just pushes Montag into the flames before he kills everyone, which is kind of funny because, of course, centuries ago, you just burned the witches. And here we are in modern times here and still burning the witches. And then the scene cuts to the ending where you have Jack and Sherry back at home talking about what happened. Then the film takes that weird, surreal turn where Jack reveals himself to be Montag, and he starts peeling the skin off his face, and Montag appears, and then he starts brutally murdering Sherry and disemboweling her and tearing her guts out, and she starts laughing hysterically and says, you're actually in my illusion, ha ha ha. And he's like, wait a second, I'm Montag, that can't be. And then the scene cuts again, and then we're back to the beginning of the film. He's on stage giving the same speech about illusion and reality he did in the beginning. So the suggestion for me was that he's just like a prop in his own illusion. He thought he was the magician. He was the one creating the illusion and the puppeteer, but it turns out he's caught within his own illusion, and so it just leaves you with this questioning of what's real and what's not at the end of the movie.
I mean, that's a cheesy, campy note, right? But it actually, I think, it very shrewdly comments on the narrative structure of the film. And I think one of the things that's striking again about these kinds of films is that rather than a linear narrative, what they give us is a circular narrative where we're constantly returning to these ritualistic explosions of violence. And that's the only guaranteed thing in this cinematic splatter world.
Yeah. And that body horror puts emphasis on the grotesque, or on the body in like a grotesque state, where our materiality, our physicality, and mortality is at the center of it. We can pivot to the 2007 remake now. This film takes that core premise, but handles it in a little more nuanced, polished way. You got the sadistic magician, Montag the Magnificent here, played by Crispin Glover. And the interesting thing about the context of Montag's shows here is that they're not for the general audience or for like the mass consumption audience. The place they go, it looks like some kind of like goth 80s or grunge fetish club where people go there who have very specialized tastes in like bondage or torture, and introduces like kind of a psychological component to it as well. You have this character, a journalist named Ed Bigelow, played by Kip Pardue. And Ed Bigelow is a journalist who starts getting fascinated by Montag. He believes that he's actually killing these women. He wants to expose them. this remake definitely, I feel, wanted to just introduce other elements beyond actual shocking horror violence. It's still a shock movie, but I think it wanted to have elements of social commentary and some psychological layers to it to unpack.
I didn't like it nearly as well.
Oh,
I,
okay.
I'm kind of wondering about my response to it because when I really look at the film, I think that it's trying to do a lot of things that are quite similar. Again, there's this disregard for conventional linear narrative. There's this disregard of plot points as if they matter. Because, like, at the end of the film, I really have no idea who did what or who's finally responsible. And yet, in spite of that, there was this, like you said, this polish and this kind of like level of narrative depth that I felt was kind of extraneous and redundant and sort of missed the point of what makes the grindhouse tradition interesting. I kind of feel that way about most of Tarantino's films post 90s, where he goes back and mines the grindhouse and the exploitation traditions for his own cinema, but makes them into these big budget, seamless, polished things. And I feel like something's been stolen from my experience as a result, that I've been robbed of what should have been a unique experience, but now sort of more closely resembles, a kind of garden variety film going experience. Um, and yet there are things interesting in it. I think that the level of compositionality is still very circular and weird and surreal. It's a very strange film. It understands that that's what it wants to be.
Yeah.
And yet it's not as striking. It doesn't hit home with the same kind of weird, surreal edge that the original does.
Another thing about the film is the actual magic shows. Now they are more technically proficient, I think, in terms of how they present illusionism than the first movie. In the first film, it's all in very bright fluorescent lighting. There's not much interesting like playing with light or the camera. I think they make the magic shows a little more interesting visually here. Playing with mirrors and glass surfaces and smoke and lighting to amp up that sense of illusionism and spectacle. Again, that appeals to modern taste because we seek that at even modern horror films. We don't want just like a trashy movie. I mean, we like a trash element still. I think a lot of people do, including myself, but we like something a little more polished, that is just not immediately disposable.
The film doesn't really go all in the way the original does. It still wants to have its cake and eat it too. And I think that the splatter scenes are emblematic of that because unlike the first film, there's much more of an attempt to suture them into the overall narrative, as convoluted as it is.
Yeah.
There's not as much dwelling on them, and there isn't the same kind of caustic, strange drawing out in time and space of these murders and the splatter effect.
Everything about this film has almost like a gothic or a Tim Burton-esque kind of gothic style and ambiance to it. It's set in Los Angeles, but the actual time and period or era in which the movie takes place, we don't know. Even Ed Bigelow, he dresses in this kind of classic, almost Hollywood style, and it has a film noir ambiance to it. So Ed, he's trying to expose Montag, and he has some shady dealings behind the scenes. And one of the people he knows is Dr. Chong, played by the great Brad Dourif. He has a drug business, has a prostitution ring he runs. He's just this eccentric character, and he's almost like a shaman and a medicine man too. He uses like leeches in one scene to heal Ed's character. Whenever you see Brad Dourif, he always has a bunch of leeches on his back, and he's like bleeding himself dry. At this point, you don't know what's going on with Ed. He seems to be in like a drug-induced hallucination state. One of the subplots of the movie is that Montag, the way he's able to control his victims as well as the audience, is he drugs them with this hallucinogen. The leech medicine cure is used to drain like the toxic poison from your system. What you discover, Ed Bigelow has taken this drug and is hallucinating. But Brad Dourif, again, back to him, he's just a funny character. He has a whole like Vietnam story. And I was like, oh, here we go. Everyone's got a Vietnam story, just a funny, cheesy scene. I enjoyed all his scenes, but the plot is very convoluted. And does it lead to anywhere at the end? And for me, I think I'm on the same level with you that I'm not sure it lifts the narrative up beyond the actual like exploitation factor.
No, it didn't, and I think the impulse to do that is kind of mistaking what made that film the unique experience that it was, which is that there isn't a payoff and there isn't a suturing together of these narrative components and there isn't psychological depth. You don't get closure or resolution at the end of the film at all.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I actually think that the original film is far less exploitative from a misogynistic perspective than the remake is.
Maggie, his girlfriend, calls him out from the get-go after the first magic show. She says to Ed, hey, you're getting off on misogyny here.
So the idea that we have the Maggie character attenuating our phallic pleasure by calling out Ed, and then later we actually do get one male victim as opposed to all women. Those are token moments. The overall film that we get is I think even more brazenly phallocentric and sadistic in its kind of androcentric appetites, as much more than I think even the original one is.
She calls him out, and it's like, okay, that's a little more nuanced treatment of like the misogyny. It's introducing it as an element to critique in the movie. But then, as we were saying, does it really do that? She's just treated as a victim, as an object of a desire and torture, like every other female character in the first movie. Her backstory is that she was an escort in this specialized escort service called the March Hare. And they cater to men who like to torture women for pleasure. And so she's not a dominatrix, she's like a submissive. And so men pay her to hurt her. Now you find that Ed, this drug he's taken causes memory loss. And he's forgotten about the fact that he met her as an escort. You discover there's like some kind of snuff video made of him, brutally like beating her. The March Hare escort service, that was a reference to like Alice in Wonderland.
Of course.
Yeah. The March Hare and the Mad Hatter at the Tea Party. And so that comes back to what I was saying, like the kind of goth Tim Burton kind of esque surrealism of the movie. And March Hare, I think one of the English proverbs about the March Hare is as mad as a March Hare. And I think it's a reference to like the aggressive like nature of male hares during the breeding season.
Oh, interesting.
So, I mean, those little touches add this kind of surreal aspect to the movie that's in keeping with like the underlying themes. And then at Bigelow, you find out that he's been the perpetrator behind all these murders.
And as I said, it also gives you that payoff at the end, that kind of semi-metatextual moment of male fantasy and dominance, where Ed reigns supreme as the man behind the scenes, the Wizard of Oz, so to speak.
That's where the question when we bring up, okay, it's introducing this commentary and the ethical implications of watching women and female victimization, but then you're left with this man and the serial killer in this position of power.
The remake seems to be kind of waffling back and forth about whether it's continuing in that grindhouse tradition or if it's trying to do what you say, which is elevated a little bit. And I think the film does try to give you a kind of payoff at the end by revealing the Bigelow character as this kind of metatextual proxy for the filmmaker. He's the new Wizard of Gore, behind the camera, controlling the audience, controlling the GIMP, and controlling everyone. So, I mean, whereas the first film mocks the whole idea of being in control of the events, the remake sort of tries to actually, in a strange way, give you that phallocentric control. I mean, it's attenuated by the fact that Kip Purdue, like the original actor, he can't act. He's not an interesting or compelling character. And it's not as if the film dwells on the mastery he's attained at the end. I mean, the film ends really suddenly. And yet still there's this idea, this narrative carrot of here's the payoff. Kip Purdue is now the Wizard of Gore, or Bigelow is the Wizard of Gore. And I felt dissatisfied by that because I think it tried to respect me a little too much as a viewer.
Yeah.
I don't deserve that much respect as a viewer, which is why I like grindhouse films.
Like the references to ancient torture methods or Alice in Wonderland, I think they are there too as this pretentious layering and framing of what's something that's not terribly deep. You don't have to have that pretension. You could strip all that away and then you just have a schlocky horror film. And I don't think it would lift or diminish what you were watching in any way. So
no, well, and it would have given me, I think, a more respect for the film, because I think I would have been more struck by how the film is pushing aside and dismissing some of the baggage that is also too often de rigueur, especially with a remake. You feel like you have to continue this tradition and appeal to the connoisseurs and the target audience, and I think the film falls into that trap. Whereas, Lewis and the other grindhouse filmmakers is like, let's get this done, let's make a buck.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the original is funny, intentionally or unintentionally, inadvertently funny. Like this movie, the remake, you don't get too many laughs because I think it tried to go for more of a polished horror film that will appeal to modern taste. And so
it so desperately wants to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and yet it's still a B movie. You can't get away from that it's a B movie, and the centerpieces are the brutal murder scenes. That's what your audience base is. But I think this film was just trying to have a little bit of too much artistic credibility, and so it lacked in laughs for that reason too. So I can't even laugh at how bad it is, So.
Well, it's not a funny film at all. It doesn't have any of that chunky, campy appeal of the original. And I think some of it has to do with the 70s aesthetic you referred to. But I also think it's that the film is just incredibly cynical. It doesn't believe in the project that it's undertaken at all. And it feels like it has to layer it over with all of these references and this slick kind of hyper intensified film effects. And as a result, we're left with a film that looks a great deal more like a lot of the other films that we're forced to sit through nowadays.
All right. Well, that's a wrap here. I mean, those are our thoughts and opinions on The Wizard of Gore, which I hadn't heard of until recently here. Actually, when you first told me about this movie, I thought like gore was a reference to some fantasy thing, like there's a movie called Gore, but then I realized, they mean actual like gore as in blood,
Yeah, nothing that sophisticated.
Yeah. Anyway, hope everyone enjoyed that, and let us know if you've seen either The Wizard of Gore, the 1970 version, or the 2007 remake. Yeah, feel free to share your thoughts, and we'll look forward to doing another one of these movie discussions, and we'll see you next time here. All right. Bye.
Bye.
All right, cool. That was good.
Yeah, man.